The courtroom was filled with tension. People sat on the edge of their seats, whispering to one another, their eyes darting back and forth between the judge and the officers standing near the defendant. It was supposed to be just another day in court, a routine hearing, a case that wouldn't make headlines. But in an instant, everything changed. A young black woman, no older than her mid-20s, stood before the judge, her hands clenched into fists as she tried to keep her emotions in check. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't dangerous. She was there for something minor, something that shouldn't have turned into a spectacle. But then, out of nowhere, an officer, one who had already been watching her with narrowed eyes, took a step forward. What happened next sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Gasps filled the air. A murmur of disbelief spread across the room like wildfire. Cameras flashed as people scrambled to capture the moment. The officer, his face emotionless, had just done something unthinkable. But as the seconds ticked by, something even more unexpected began to unfold, something that would leave everyone speechless. And while this courtroom drama played out, across town, another story was taking shape. A teenage boy sat quietly on a crowded bus, his headphones in, lost in thought. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He had no idea that a simple act of kindness, giving up his seat for a pregnant woman, would lead to a moment he would never forget. As he stood up and gestured for the woman to sit, she smiled warmly and took his place. But just as he turned to step away, she reached for his hand and slipped something into his palm. A note. His heart pounded as he unfolded the small piece of paper. The words written inside made his breath hitch, his eyes widen. It wasn't just a simple thank you. It was something much bigger, something life-changing. What was written on that note? And what happened to the officer in the courtroom? The answers will leave you stunned. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The young black woman barely had time to react. The courtroom was spinning, not from dizziness, but from the sheer disbelief of what had just happened. The officer had kicked her. Not a shove, not a push, an actual kick. It wasn't some accident or a misstep. It was deliberate. People gasped, some even stood up in shock, their eyes darting between her and the officer. The judge's gavel slammed down, demanding order, but the air was thick with confusion and anger. She stumbled back slightly, catching herself on the defense table. Her heart pounded in her chest. The officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face, didn't flinch. His expression was cold, unreadable, as if he hadn't just committed an act of outright aggression in front of an entire room of people. It was as if, in his mind, she didn't matter. As if no one would do anything about it. The woman's eyes stung, but not from pain. It was the humiliation. The burning feeling of being treated like she was nothing. Like she didn't deserve respect. She clenched her jaw, her breath uneven. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to do something, to say something. But what could she do? This was a courtroom. A place where justice was supposed to be served, yet here she was, being treated unfairly by the very people meant to uphold the law. Murmurs filled the room. People whispered to each other, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Others pulled out their phones, recording, knowing that moments like these often disappeared unless they were captured. The judge looked uncomfortable, glancing at the officer, then back at the woman, as if unsure how to proceed. And then something changed. The officer took a step back, shifting slightly. It was subtle, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. A nervousness. Maybe he realized he had made a mistake. Maybe he had assumed no one would care, but now, with all eyes on him, with cameras pointed in his direction, he seemed to feel the weight of his actions. Across town, on the crowded bus, the teenage boy still held the small note in his hand. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The pregnant woman who had given it to him was already settling into the seat, rubbing her belly absent-mindedly, looking exhausted but grateful. She didn't even glance his way, as if she had simply passed him the note and moved on. But as his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught in his throat. "Meet me at this address tomorrow. I have something important for you." Underneath, there was an address scribbled in neat handwriting. His heart pounded. He looked up at the woman, his mouth slightly open, but she was staring out the window, lost in thought. Why would a stranger give him a note like this? What could be so important? And why him? His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she had mistaken him for someone else. Maybe this was some kind of joke. But deep down, something told him this was serious. He thought back to the moment he had given up his seat. It hadn't been a big deal, at least not to him. It was just the right thing to do. His mother had always taught him to respect others, especially elders, pregnant women, and those in need. He had grown up watching her struggle, carrying groceries alone, working long shifts, never once complaining. He knew how small acts of kindness could make a difference. But still, this was different. This was more than a simple thank you. The bus jolted to a stop, and a few passengers shuffled off. The boy read the note again, his pulse quickening. A part of him wanted to ignore it. What if it was dangerous? What if it led him somewhere he shouldn't be? But another part of him, the part that was curious, the part that felt like this moment wasn't just random, told him he needed to find out. Back in the courtroom, the tension had only grown thicker. The woman straightened herself, her hands still shaking slightly, but she refused to let anyone see her weakness. She had been through too much in life to let this moment define her. She looked at the officer, really looked at him. His face was still stone cold, but there was a crack in his armor. He knew he had gone too far. Maybe he was trying to act like it didn't matter, like he could walk away from this without consequences, but something in his stance told her otherwise. Then someone stood up from the back of the courtroom. A man, dressed in a suit, his face tense with anger. He stepped forward, pointing directly at the officer. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "I just saw what happened, and so did everyone else in this room." The room fell silent. Even the judge seemed momentarily stunned. The officer tensed, his jaw clenching. He wasn't used to being called out. He wasn't used to people standing up against him. The woman didn't know who this man was, but in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt since she walked into that courtroom. Hope. Meanwhile, the boy sat on the bus, staring at the note, feeling the weight of whatever was waiting for him the next day. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. The courtroom remained frozen in time, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone inside. The man who had spoken up stood firm, his eyes locked on the officer. The woman felt her breath catch in her throat. People didn't usually speak out like this, not in places like this, not against people like him. The officer's face was unreadable, but there was tension in his jaw, a slight shift in his stance. He was used to being in control, to his authority going unquestioned. But now, with all eyes on him, he seemed unsure, like for the first time, the power wasn't entirely his. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Let's maintain order in this courtroom," he said, his voice measured but firm. But there was no ignoring what had just happened. The energy in the room had changed. People weren't just passive observers anymore, they were witnesses. The woman felt her pulse slow, but her mind was racing. Who was this man who had defended her? She had never seen him before, but something in the way he stood, in the certainty of his voice, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. But before she could say anything, the officer took a step forward. He didn't look at her. He looked at the judge, as if trying to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor," he said, his voice level but tight, "I was simply trying to keep order." She was being aggressive. The woman's mouth fell open. Aggressive? She hadn't done anything. She had barely spoken. A murmur of disbelief spread through the courtroom again. The man in the suit shook his head. "That's not what happened, and you know it," he said, his voice steady. "There are people here who saw everything. There are cameras. Do you really think you can twist the truth in front of all of us?" The officer's expression hardened, but for the first time, there was something behind his eyes, uncertainty. He wasn't used to people pushing back. He had always operated in the shadows of doubt, where his word carried more weight than the truth. But this time, the truth was standing right in front of him. Across town, the teenage boy couldn't stop staring at the note. The bus ride felt longer than usual, his thoughts circling the words over and over. The address was unfamiliar to him, somewhere he had never been before. He pulled out his phone, quickly typing it into the Maps app. It wasn't far, maybe a 30-minute walk from his neighborhood. His fingers hovered over the screen. Should he even go?
He didn't know this woman.
He didn't know what she wanted. But something inside him, something he couldn't explain, told him this wasn't random. This was bigger than just a simple act of kindness. When he got home, his mother was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. She looked up and smiled, the exhaustion in her eyes barely hidden behind her warmth. "You're late," she said, turning down the heat. "Missed my first bus," he said automatically, slipping the note into his pocket. His mother eyed him, like she could sense something was off. "You okay?" He nodded quickly.
Yeah.
"Just tired." She didn't press. She never did. She trusted him to come to her when he was ready. But as he ate dinner, his mind wasn't on the food. It was on tomorrow. On the note. On the woman. The next morning, he stood in front of the address scribbled on the paper. It was a small cafe, tucked between two larger buildings, the kind of place that didn't stand out but probably had regulars who knew it well. He hesitated before stepping inside. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. A few customers sat at wooden tables, lost in conversation or their laptops. And there, in the corner, was the woman. She looked up, as if she had been expecting him. "You came," she said with a small smile, her hands resting gently on her stomach. He nodded, suddenly unsure what to say.
Yeah.
I got your note." She gestured to the seat across from her.
Sit.
"We need to talk." Back in the courtroom, the tension had reached a boiling point. The woman knew she had a choice. She could stay silent, let things move forward the way they always did. Or she could speak. Her voice didn't shake when she finally spoke. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officer tensed, like he had expected her to stay quiet. The judge watched her carefully. The man in the suit nodded. She deserves to be heard. And for the first time, it seemed like maybe she would be. The air in the courtroom felt thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The woman stood tall, her hands trembling but steadying as she spoke. Every word, she said, felt like it carried the weight of every injustice she had faced, every unfair moment she had swallowed without protest. But now, she was no longer staying quiet. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said again, louder this time, the truth hanging in her words. "I was just standing there. I wasn't being aggressive. I wasn't threatening anyone." The officer's eyes flashed with something. Was it guilt? Or was it anger? His hands were clenched at his sides, and though he stood straight, there was a subtle tension in his posture, like he was bracing himself for a storm. The room had grown silent, every eye in the courtroom on the two of them. The judge looked between them, his fingers tapping lightly against the gavel, as though unsure whether to call for order or let the moment play out. The man in the suit didn't back down. "You can't just kick someone because you feel like it. She didn't provoke you. The only thing that happened was that you abused your power." The officer's lips tightened into a thin line. He was trying to keep his cool, trying to maintain control, but it was slipping. People were watching. The cameras were recording. The voices of the people in the courtroom were starting to rise in quiet murmurs. The truth was there, obvious and undeniable. But the officer's next move was unexpected. Without warning, he turned sharply to the judge. "Your Honor, this is nonsense. I'm just doing my job. This woman is trying to twist everything into something it's not." The judge didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the officer, his brow furrowed. Everyone could see the shift in the atmosphere, the tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The officer's deflection wasn't working anymore. He had overplayed his hand, and now, people were beginning to doubt him. At that very moment, the woman locked eyes with the man who had stood up for her earlier. He gave her a slight nod, a silent signal that she wasn't alone. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected someone to speak up for her in a place like this. The walls of fear and isolation that had built up around her over the years were crumbling, piece by piece. But she knew she wasn't safe yet. The battle wasn't won. It was only just beginning. Outside, the world was moving on. But in the quiet of that courtroom, everything was at a standstill, and it felt as if every decision, every word spoken, would decide the outcome of her life. Meanwhile, across town, the teenage boy sat across from the pregnant woman in the cafe. His fingers drummed nervously against the table as he tried to make sense of what was happening. She looked at him with calm eyes, her hand still resting gently on her stomach. There was something reassuring about her presence, something that made him feel like whatever was going on here, whatever she wanted to tell him, was important. "I know this might be strange," she began, her voice soft but firm, "but I've been following your story for a while." His brow furrowed. "My story? What do you mean?" She smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I've been following the news, and I've heard about your family, about your struggles, and about your kindness. You see, I'm not just any stranger, and neither is this note. I've been looking for someone like you for a reason." His heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he could feel the gravity of the moment. Every instinct told him this was more than just a conversation about a bus ride or a seat given up to a pregnant woman. This was bigger. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I have something that can change everything for you. But first, you have to make a choice." He felt the weight of her words, the mystery of them. What choice? What could she possibly offer him that would change his life? He was just a kid, trying to make it day by day, doing his best to help his mom and get by. What could he possibly have to do with someone like her? Before he could ask another question, she slid an envelope across the table, pushing it toward him. He hesitated, staring at the envelope. There was no return address, no indication of who it was from, only a single piece of paper inside. "Open it," she urged gently. He slowly reached for the envelope, the tension mounting in the air. His fingers brushed the paper as he pulled it out, unfolding it to reveal a single sentence that made his heart race. It was a letter, but not just any letter. It was a letter that would change the course of his life forever. Back in the courtroom, the tension had reached its peak. The judge finally lifted the gavel, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is unacceptable conduct, officer. We will be reviewing this matter thoroughly." The officer's face twitched, his jaw tightening. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for things to go sideways. But they were. And now, it seemed like the truth was beginning to shine through. As the courtroom waited for the next move, the woman stood her ground, her eyes steady. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she wasn't backing down. The wheels of justice were turning, slowly but surely, and she could feel the momentum shifting in her favor. The boy, still holding the letter in his hands, sat frozen, his mind racing. What was this all about? What could she want from him? The answers were within reach, but neither of them knew that what was about to unfold would bring them together in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The boy's fingers trembled as he stared at the letter in his hand. His mind raced with questions, each one more pressing than the last. Who was this woman? Why had she singled him out? What could possibly be so urgent, so important, that she had sought him out in the first place? He felt a chill run down his spine, as if the ground beneath him was shifting, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. Before he could open his mouth to ask another question, the woman's phone buzzed, breaking the silence that had settled between them. She glanced at the screen, her face tightening for a brief moment, then quickly turned her attention back to him. Something in her eyes had changed. The calm, reassuring warmth was gone, replaced by a flicker of something more intense, more guarded. "I have to go," she said, her voice low. There was a new urgency in her words, something he hadn't expected. "You'll need to read that letter, and you'll need to do it quickly. But before you do, promise me something. Promise me you'll stay safe." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and before he could ask anything else, she stood up and walked toward the door. He watched her go, confusion swirling inside him. What was happening? He looked down at the envelope again, his pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. The way she had acted, the way she had left so suddenly, it all felt like a signal, like a warning. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just a strange encounter. His mind was racing, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to find out what this was all about. Back in the courtroom, the mood had shifted again. The officer's face had gone pale, but he was doing his best to maintain his composure. The woman, who had once felt so small under the weight of the system, now stood like a pillar of strength. The man in the suit had positioned himself beside her, a silent ally in her fight for justice. The crowd in the courtroom was waiting, holding its collective breath, watching to see what would happen next. The judge had adjourned the session for a brief moment to allow tempers to cool. But the air was thick with tension. Whispers of outrage filled the room, and the woman could feel the eyes of everyone on her, judging, questioning, but also, for the first time, truly seeing her. As she stood there, waiting, her thoughts kept returning to the officer. She knew he was in trouble. She could feel it in the way his shoulders had slumped, the way his eyes flickered from side to side, betraying the mask of confidence he had worn so easily up until now. She couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to act the way he had. What had made him think he could get away with something like this in front of so many witnesses?
But there was no time for that now.
Her attention was pulled back to the man in the suit who was speaking with a detective in the back of the courtroom. His words were low, but the woman could make out a few key phrases. Not just about this case, and we need to move fast. Her heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? Was there something else going on here? Something larger? Something they weren't telling her? Suddenly, the door to the courtroom swung open, and a new figure stepped in, another officer. But this one was different. He walked in with a sense of purpose, a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. His eyes scanned the room, landing first on the officer who had kicked the woman, then quickly moving to the judge. There was no denying the tension in the air as the two officers exchanged glances. The man in the suit, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, moved toward the new officer. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tense. The new officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the woman, his eyes locking onto hers for a long moment. It was as if he was measuring her, sizing her up, and for a brief second, she felt a chill run down her spine. He didn't look like he was there to help. "I'm here to assist with an ongoing investigation," the officer said finally, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "I think it's time we all understood just what's really happening here." The words hit her like a slap. An investigation? Was this about more than just what had happened in the courtroom? Was there something deeper, something darker, behind the officer's actions? And then, just as quickly, the officer's gaze shifted to the original officer, the one who had kicked her. The woman could see the flash of recognition between them, the briefest flicker of something almost imperceptible, but in that moment, she knew. She knew that whatever was happening, whatever this investigation was about, it had just taken a dangerous turn. Outside, the boy was still holding the letter in his hand, the paper crinkling under his fingers as he tried to make sense of everything. He had barely taken a step when he noticed something strange. A black SUV had pulled up to the curb, the engine purring quietly. His heart skipped a beat as he realized something was wrong. The door to the cafe opened slowly, and a man stepped out, his face obscured by the brim of a dark hat. He scanned the street quickly before his gaze landed on the boy. There was no mistaking it. This man was looking for him.
His pulse spiked.
He quickly glanced around, searching for an escape, but it was too late. The man was moving toward him, his steps deliberate, calm, but there was a coldness in his eyes that sent a shiver down the boy's spine. "Come with me," the man said softly, his voice low, almost too quiet. "You don't have a choice." The boy's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know who this man was or why he was so determined to find him, but it was clear now. The game had changed. The stakes had just been raised, and whatever was unfolding, whatever web was being woven, he was right in the middle of it. As the man stepped closer, the boy's mind raced. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to find answers. And fast. The man in the dark hat was closing in, his pace steady and unhurried, but each step felt like it was closing in on the boy's last chance for escape. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow. He knew he had to act fast. But just as the man reached out for him, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Hey, get away from him." The boy's head whipped around to see the woman from the cafe rushing toward them, her face set with determination. The man paused, his hand still outstretched but now hesitating. She reached him just as the boy took a step back, trying to distance himself from both of them. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice firm, but there was a hint of fear in it too. "Why are you following him?" The man glanced at her, but didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. His intentions were clear, and they were anything but innocent. The woman's instincts screamed at her to protect the boy, but she was well aware that she couldn't take on this man alone. She had no idea what he was capable of or who he was working for. But what she did know was that whatever had started in the courtroom, whatever had brought her and the boy together, had now led them to this dangerous moment. "You don't need to get involved," the man said slowly, his voice cold, but with an edge of menace. "This doesn't concern you." The woman stepped closer, blocking the boy from the man's reach. "I'm not letting you take him." Not without an explanation. The man's lips curled into a thin smile, his eyes cold and calculating. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, taking another step forward, his shadow looming over her. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than both of you." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Bigger?
What are you talking about?"
The man's smile widened. "You've been part of this from the start, but you don't even know it." He paused, watching the confusion play across her face. "The officer you defended in that courtroom, he's not who you think he is." The woman's blood ran cold. What was he saying? "Do you know what's really going on?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. "This isn't just about an unjust arrest or a simple act of aggression. This is about something much deeper. Something dangerous." Suddenly, everything clicked. The pieces of the puzzle she hadn't been able to put together were starting to fall into place. The officer, his strange behavior, the tension in the courtroom, it was all part of a larger conspiracy, something she had only glimpsed at the edges of her mind but had never been able to fully comprehend. Before she could respond, the man turned his attention back to the boy. "You don't even know what you're holding," he said softly, eyeing the envelope in the boy's hand. "That letter, it's not just some random note. It's the key to everything. The key to your future." The boy's eyes widened in confusion. What do you mean?" The man looked at him like he was a puzzle piece he'd been searching for. "You're part of something far bigger than you could ever imagine. The woman you helped, the life she's been living, it's all connected to you. That letter." He laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "It's a message. A warning. And now you're involved whether you like it or not." The woman stood in front of the boy, her mind spinning. This couldn't be real. This was too much to process. But then she looked at the boy's face, the confusion, the fear, and she realized with a sickening certainty that it was all true. She needed to protect him. She needed to protect them both. In a split second, she made a decision. "Run," she whispered urgently to the boy. "Get out of here.
"Go. Now."
Before the man could react, she grabbed the boy's arm and shoved him toward the alleyway that led behind the cafe. The boy didn't hesitate. Fear surged through him, but it wasn't just fear for himself. It was fear for her too. As they ran, the woman could hear the man's footsteps behind them, but he wasn't chasing them. Not yet. The boy's breath was heavy, his heart racing as they turned a corner and ducked behind a dumpster. They both crouched low, trying to stay out of sight. The woman's mind was racing. What was happening? Who was that man?
What did he want with them?
They stayed there, hidden, for what felt like an eternity. The city around them was buzzing with life, but here, in this narrow alley, it felt like the world had paused. The boy looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. Why was he after me?" he asked, his voice shaking. The woman didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure how to explain everything.
How could she?
There were too many pieces missing, too many things she didn't know. But just as she was about to speak, a familiar voice echoed down the alley. It was the man in the suit, the one who had helped her in the courtroom. He appeared from the shadows, his face calm but determined. "He's gone," he said, his voice steady. "For now." The woman breathed a sigh of relief, but the weight of the situation didn't lift.
There was still so much they didn't know.
So much they needed to understand. You have no idea what's really happening here, do you? The man said, his gaze shifting between her and the boy. You were never meant to be just bystanders in this. You were always meant to be part of the story. The boy, still reeling from everything that had happened, shook his head. I don't understand. What do you mean? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out a small device from his pocket and turned it on. A map appeared on the screen, showing locations, names, dates, everything. This, he said, pointing to the map, is the tip of the iceberg. What you're holding, what you've both been part of, could change everything. But there are others who will stop at nothing to make sure it doesn't see the light of day. The woman's stomach dropped. This was far from over. It was just beginning. And whatever was about to unfold, it was going to be even more dangerous than she ever could have imagined. The man with the map stood before them, his face stoic, but with an underlying urgency. The woman and the boy exchanged a look, both of them still processing the chaos that had unfolded in such a short amount of time. The boy was shaking, his grip on the envelope tightening, and the woman's mind was racing to connect the dots. Who are you? She finally asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion.
She had to know.
She had to understand who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, who had orchestrated all of this. The man paused for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Then he sighed and spoke in a low voice. My name is John, he said simply. I've been investigating a network of corruption within law enforcement and government officials for years now. The officer you encountered earlier, the one who attacked you, he's just a small piece of a much larger operation. The weight of his words hit both of them like a wave. The boy still looked confused, but the woman, having experienced firsthand the consequences of corruption, began to understand the gravity of what they were involved in. This wasn't just about an abusive officer. It was about a system so deeply entrenched in corruption that it threatened to swallow everything in its path. You're telling me this officer was part of something much bigger? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. But why me? Why is my story part of this? John met her gaze, his eyes filled with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Because you're tied to it. The investigation that's been going on in the background has been following a pattern, one that links your case to something far more dangerous than a simple act of police brutality. The officer you confronted was involved in illegal activities, drug trafficking, bribery, and more, and he was using his position to cover up his tracks. But there's one thing he didn't expect: you. The woman's mind was racing now, everything beginning to come together. She had always known there was something off about the way things unfolded in the courtroom, about the way the system had tried to silence her. But this was more than she could have imagined. She had unknowingly become a part of something much larger than herself, a small cog in a machine that she hadn't even known existed. John continued, his voice filled with determination. That letter the boy's holding? It's not just a letter. It's evidence, a key piece that ties everything together. But getting it into the wrong hands could be disastrous. We've already seen what happens when the corrupt have too much power. The boy finally spoke, his voice shaky. So, what happens now? What do we do with all this? John looked at him, then at the woman. You keep it safe. You make sure this information gets to the right people. We've been tracking the organization for months, but we need someone on the inside to bring it down. Someone like you. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The danger isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. But if you can expose the truth, you might just be able to change everything. The boy was still reeling, but the woman could feel the resolve within her growing. She wasn't going to let this go. She couldn't. The injustice she had experienced, the pain of seeing others suffer at the hands of those meant to protect them, it was too much to ignore. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged by a system designed to keep them down. What's our next move? She asked, determination in her voice. John's expression softened, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. First, we lay low. The people behind this won't stop. They'll do everything in their power to erase any trace of this investigation. You need to get the letter into the right hands, someone who can use it to expose everything, someone who won't be swayed by the threats that will come. You both have the power to make a difference. But you have to be careful. The woman nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had always known the world wasn't fair, but she hadn't fully understood how deep the injustice ran. Now, she had the power to do something about it. She wasn't going to let fear stop her.
Not now.
And with that, John turned, disappearing into the shadows just as quietly as he had arrived. The woman and the boy stood there for a moment, taking in the enormity of the situation. There were still so many unknowns, so many questions without answers. But one thing was certain. They weren't going to back down. They had come too far, faced too much, and they weren't going to stop now. As the boy looked up at her, he managed a small smile. Do you think we can actually do this? Bring them all down. The woman met his gaze, a fierce determination in her own eyes. I don't know what the future holds. But I do know this, we don't fight alone. We fight for what's right. And if we can do that, then maybe, just maybe, we'll make a difference. The boy nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him as well. This wasn't just about one act of injustice. It was about standing up against a system that had long been broken, about making sure the voices of the oppressed were finally heard. As they walked away from the alley, the city around them seemed quieter, more subdued. But in their hearts, a fire was burning, one fueled by the need for change, for justice, and for the truth to be revealed. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. They would face challenges, threats, and obstacles along the way. But as they moved forward, they knew one thing. The fight had only just begun. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows on the streets, the woman and the boy took their first steps toward an uncertain future, knowing that their actions had the power to shift the tides of history. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And the world would never be the same again. The truth had finally found its way into the light. But the journey was far from over. Equals 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 equals.